This is a little different. I'm preaching from my home because we did church at home on Sunday, and it was a kind of an odd day with the power outage and the wind event. And we did. My wife and I did church at home. We had our community group over for brunch here, and had a great day. I hope you did as well. But I prepared this sermon, and we're finishing our series on David. And so we thought, hey, why waste it? And why not record? Since we did church at home, why not record in my home? So I'm just going to share with you some thoughts and some study I've done on 2 Samuel chapter 22 and 23, which is really kind of the end of the story of David as the book of Samuel accounts it. And so what I want to do is start by just reading. I'm going to read the first 8 verses of chapter 22. I would encourage you, if you're at home and watching this, that feel free to pause this and just read the first 20 or really the first 20 verses or the first chapter, chapter 22 on your own. But here we go. The first 8 verses says this: David sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies, from the hand of Saul. This is what he's saying. He's saying, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation. He's my stronghold, my refuge, and my savior from violent people. You save me. I call to the Lord, who's worthy of praise, and have been saved from my enemies. I'm going to stop there. That's just the first 4 verses. Again, I'd encourage you to read the whole chapter, but I love this. I think the first 4 verses encapsulate what David is saying here. He says, my God is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my refuge. Right? My God is my rock in whom I take refuge. And David, I think it's interesting to know, David didn't just say these words, he sang these words out. Right? And you know the difference, don't you? There's a difference between I got the job and I got the job, right? There's a reason I don't serve on the worship team, by the way. But right, there's a difference between saying something and singing something. And David is singing this. And over the last 8 weeks or so, we've been following David's life along with a bunch of other churches in the Bay Area. It's been really fun to do that with other churches. And what we've seen is that David lived a pretty hard life. You know, he was made king by God, but then he had to run into the desert for a couple of decades away from Saul, who was the current king, because Saul was trying to kill him. And then when he became king, he had to run away in the desert for a while still because his enemies, the Philistines especially, were trying to kill him and destroy his people. And so the author tells us that it was after all of this, after God had saved David from Saul and after God had saved David from the Philistines and given him the land he had actually promised decades previous, that David sang these words, my God is my rock. And I think this song defines David's whole life. I think, in fact, it's interesting because this song is written by David and sung by David far earlier in his life, and yet the author puts it at the end of 2 Samuel because it's indicative and it is characteristic of David's entire life, really. And so my goal as we kind of look at this passage is for you to get you to realize that this can be your song also. This can be the song that characterizes your life as well, the song that you get to sing out. And you and I you're probably not facing enemies that are trying to kill you. I know I'm certainly not, as far as I know of, right? Where I'm not, there's not people out trying to murder us like they were David. But Scripture says that we do have enemies, that we don't battle flesh and blood, but that there's a spiritual world out there that is attacking us, that is attacking you. And honestly, that's trying to destroy you. And so if you're like me, and your world, right, sometimes your world just begins to shift and crumble and shake all around you. And maybe your life hasn't ended up like you hoped it would, or like you dreamed it would. Maybe you're feeling hopeless, or life is just harder. It's just harder than you thought it would be. Being a parent is harder than you thought it would be. Being single is harder than you thought it would be. Your job and going to work every day, day in and day out, is just harder than you thought it would be. And it's not one thing, but it's just kind of hard. And the hits just keep on coming, and you're just getting more and more desperate. And what I want you to hear is that David lived much of his life like that, much of his life in that very place, and what he discovered from that place. And I think what he could have only discovered from that place is that what he says, my God is my rock. My God is my rock. And so as you're at home watching this, if you're in a place, just say that out loud. My God is my rock. And so what I want to do is look together at just one story. There's a bunch of stories as this book ends. I want to look at one that is, I think, characteristic of the rest. And I'm going to look at 2 Samuel chapter 23, verses 13 to 17. And we're going to see how God is David's rock. And so this is what the text says. It says, during the harvest time, 3 of the 30 chief warriors came down to David at the cave of Adullam, while a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. And at the time David was in the stronghold, the Philistine garrison was at Bethlehem. And David longed for water and said, "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." So the 3 mighty warriors broke through the Philistine lines, and they drew out water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, and they carried it back to David. But he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out before the Lord. "Far be it from me, Lord, to do this," he said. "Is this not the blood of the men who went at the risk of their lives?" And David would not drink it. Such were the exploits of the 3 mighty warriors. Now, this is kind of an odd story. David's come to power. He has finally been given the title of king that he was told he would have decades before. He finally gets that title. But then he's got the title, but he doesn't have the power that goes with it. His kingdom is being overrun by the Philistines. And they've invaded Israel, and they've actually set up a military camp at Bethlehem, the city called Bethlehem, which, if you look at a map, is deep into Philistine territory. It's only about 6 miles away from Jerusalem, what will eventually be the capital. And it's in the interior of the kingdom. In other words, the Philistines hadn't just taken some border town. They were in the center part of the heaviest part. The military had infiltrated the heart of the nation. And so David, this king, is now hiding out at a cave. And so this is some start to the reign of God's anointed king, right? The new king of Israel couldn't even protect his hometown, because remember, David is from Bethlehem. That's his hometown. Probably this is where he was raised, this is where he grew up. Probably some of his family had already had to flee the town when the Philistines came in. And on top of all of that, it was harvest time, it tells us. And to you and me, that means almost nothing. I mean, to me, I don't even know what that means. I don't even know what month that is. But it's harvest time. But to David and anyone else living in a subsistence farming society like they were, this had huge implications, because it meant that they were probably going to lose the whole harvest from that year. That harvest was just going to be gone, which meant even if they were able to drive the Philistines out, they're facing famine and food shortages and death. And so things looked really bad. And here David is sitting in a cave again after a day full of fruitless strategy meetings, trying to figure out what the best thing to do with his commanders is. And David just kind of leans his head back and he goes, Oh, that somebody would just get me a drink of water from the well at Bethlehem. And I think he almost says it just under his breath even. He's not saying it to anyone. He's not saying it, he's not commanding anyone to do this. He isn't even, I don't think he's even thirsty, actually. He's just in despair. He's just thinking, I'm never going to get a drink from this well. This well that I grew up drinking from, I'm never going to even see it again. I'm never going to drink from it again. And he's beginning, you can hear it, he's beginning to give up. He's beginning to despair. And I wonder if you've ever been there before. I wonder if you've ever been at that point. Maybe you're at that point right now. You're just beginning to give up and despair. Well, David's top 3 men, his top 3 commanders, his best warriors, overhear his faith wavering. And they know they've got to do something. They get together and they go, hey, let's put together a plan here. So they sneak out of camp and they go on this commando mission into enemy territory. They sneak 13 miles across enemy-occupied territory. They reach their objective. The two of them hold off and fight Philistine garrison while the other one is drawing water from the well. And then they fight their way. They lower the canteen, pull water out, and then 3 of them fight their way back out of the Philistine camp. You gotta wonder what these Philistine military army guys were thinking as they fight their way back out after just getting a cup of water. But it's this epic story of courage and devotion to their leader. It's like made for Hollywood. And then you can imagine, I mean, the drama doesn't end. They walk back into camp, and you can imagine the scene as they do. They're covered in sweat and dirt and blood, and they've got their weapons still by their side. Their weapons are still bloody, and they march through camp, and they head straight to the king's cave. And then when they get there, they pull out this canteen that they just risked their lives to fill with water, and they set it on the table. And they kneel before the king, and they say, you didn't ever think you'd drink from that well of Bethlehem? Here, drink now from the well of Bethlehem. And then there's this kind of moment of silence. Right? The king is just dumbstruck. What am I overwhelmed, right? These men risked their lives to bring him water from this well. They already had a water source. He wasn't thirsty. And then David does what seems like the most offensive and obtuse act he could have possibly done in that circumstance, right? He picks up the canteen and he looks at it. And you think he's going to bring it up to his lips, but he doesn't. He just dumps it over, just pours it out. And the water hits the dusty, dirty floor, desert floor, dry desert floor, and it just quenches, the ground just quenches the water up. There's not even really a puddle left. It's just kind of damp. And David said that he's pouring it out to the Lord, but if you're like me, that doesn't really let David off the hook, does it? I mean, these guys almost died trying to the blood is still visible on their bodies from the scratches and things that they got getting the king this water, and then he just poured it out. But if you're like me, you'd be annoyed, maybe probably angry. But if that's you, if that's where you're at, and certainly that's where I was when the first time I read this passage, I think what's happened is we've forgotten what this passage is really about. You see, this passage is not about water. The men didn't march 13 miles into Bethlehem to bring the king water. They didn't walk into the heart of the enemy stronghold to gather special liquid for the king. No. They did it to remind the king of the fact that he so firmly believed before. My God is my rock. My God is my rock. See, these men had been with David a long time. These were some of the original men that had gathered with him some decades before. They had been through a lot of battles. They had seen more desperate situations than this one, where they thought they were going to die, or they thought David was going to die. But every single time, without fail, every single time things looked worse than ever, God had delivered them, and God had intervened to save their lives and to give them victory. And so for these 3 men, it wasn't about water. It was about faith in the God who could save. And things looked really bad. Things looked hopeless. It looked like there was no way out. Their enemy was too powerful. Their warriors were too numerous. Their weapons were too strong. Their position too firm. And their strategy too flawless. And David's faith faltered, but these men said, Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. My God is my rock. He will save us. And they believed so firmly that their God was their rock, and rightly, that they were willing to walk right into the middle of the enemy camp, get water from the enemy as well, and walk right back out of that camp with their lives. They believed they could do that. And so they did. And when they placed that canteen on David's table, they didn't do it. They were telling him to have hope again. They were telling him to believe this again, to hope that the God who saved him from Goliath and the God who protected him from Saul on multiple occasions would again deliver him from the Philistines. And David's response revealed that their act of faith and devotion had worked. When he poured the water out, it was as if to say, you know what? I don't need to drink this water from the well of Bethlehem. I want to drink from the well of Bethlehem again. I'm nostalgic for the well of Bethlehem, but I don't believe I have to drink this canteen of water to do that. I believe that God's going to give us that land again, that God's going to save us no matter, even though this looks hopeless. And he's going to give us the whole land, the whole well. I hope to be able to drink from it whenever I want. And so David had enough faith that he would drink from that well again, and that next time no one would have to risk their lives for him to do it. And so he poured out the water to the Lord. In other words, it worked. In other words, what the mighty men had done for him worked. He believed again, my God is my rock. My God is my rock. So what about you? Do you believe that? Do you believe my God is my rock? And before you answer, before you go, yeah, I believe that, I'm not asking you if you theologically assent to this idea, to this statement. What I'm asking you is that when your life gets hard, when things get painful, when your life doesn't go like you thought it was going to go, when things seem hopeless and when it looks like there's no way out, and when you're under attack, how do you respond? Do you respond like God is your rock, like God will save you? Do you respond like David, who trusts in other things and which leads to despair? Or do you respond like David's men, who boldly and courageously take the offensive, believing that God will save, that they can walk right into the heart of this and that God is going to pull them out safely? See, I think like David, we tend to forget, my God is my rock. I think David has two main reasons to forget this, that he forgets this, and I think we have the same reasons, right? First, David's problems look insurmountable. Insurmountable. I mean, the Philistines are deep in their territory. They have this firm foothold. David looks around at his men and he realizes he doesn't have nearly enough men. The problem is simply too big. And don't you think that too sometimes? I know I certainly do. I look around and I go, this is too big. Yeah. God can save. God can do anything. God is powerful. But this is too big. The problems of your life seem like they are too big to be fixed. And it's gotten too complicated. It's gotten too messy, too out of control, too difficult. You're too far down the road to change anything now, right? And it's easy to read stories like this one, stories where we know the ending, stories that work out in the end, and write them off as fairy tales or unique circumstances, or as David is some special, unique guy that God works with differently. But this story isn't any of those things. In fact, the author, whose whole point of including this story is that it is characteristic of David's life and of anyone's life who trusts in God. And so your problem may look insurmountable. Maybe your marriage is a disaster. It looks like reconciliation is just impossible, like it's too far down the road. Or you're stuck in a terrible job, or stuck without a job. You'd love to have a terrible job. Or maybe you're single and you don't want to be, but it seems like all the good ones are taken. There's really nothing out there. This is just going to continue forever. Or maybe your kids are off the wall and you're just exhausted. You're overwhelmed and exhausted. Maybe there's not enough money to go around to make it work. And each month you sink a little bit deeper down. Or maybe you're just living a life. Maybe it's none of those things, but you're just living a life that God feels so absent and life feels so purposeless. and it seems like nothing's ever going to change. And so you're just losing hope. Now, I don't know what your problems are or your circumstances are right now, but here's what I do know based on my own experience and based on Scripture. Your problem might not be as big as it feels. Now, I know that's hard to hear, but I like to surf, and I like to teach other people how to surf. And one of the things I've noticed when we go surfing, when I take newbies out to go surfing, is you paddle out, and you're laying on this surfboard and paddling out, and these people come to the waves, and they go, these are massive. What are these, like 6 or 8 foot waves? And I go, no, they're like 2 foot waves. Or maybe they're 3 foot waves. But they look huge because you're laying on a surfboard, sit on top of the water, and it's all above your head. And so it looks massive. And I think a lot of our problems are like that in life. We're in the middle of it. We're right at the base of it looking up. And so we can't see the perspective. And so these problems feel bigger than they are. And so sometimes your problems that you're facing aren't nearly as big as you think they are. You're just in the middle of them, so they look big. But even if your problems are, and they might be, maybe your problems are just as big as you think they are. Here's what I know. Our God is a great problem solver. God ordered the earth and everything in it. And so he knows how it works, and he knows how to fix your problem. Even if you can't see a way out, he knows how to fix your problem. It's a little bit like a corn maze, right? If you're in it, it can seem impossible to find your way out. But if you've got an overhead picture of it, you can find the path real easily. And God's got the overhead picture. And what's interesting about God is that often he works the grandest salvation when things look the bleakest. It's true, things are often darkest before the dawn. And it's only after Israel goes into exile that God saves them from their oppressors. It's only after Lazarus dies that Jesus shows up and raises him from the dead. You see, God can solve your problems even when your problems look insurmountable. And so that's the first reason that you might forget that my God is my rock. Your problems seem insurmountable. But the second reason is that you and I think that God is weak compared to other worldly powers. David looked to his army to save him. And he looked around and he thought his men were his best chance of success. And he probably wouldn't have said that out loud, right? Because he's David. He's the king after God's own heart. But it's obvious, because as soon as he realizes that his army didn't stand a chance against the Philistine, he begins to despair. And so if you've been coming to church for a while, you probably wouldn't say out loud that your hard work is your best chance of success, or your intelligence, or who you know, your education, or your money, or your beauty, or your people skills, or your influence, your talent, your fame. You wouldn't say that those are your best chance of success. You wouldn't say that those are the things that can save you, because you know better than that. You know better than to say that anyway. But when those human efforts don't work, when life is crashing in on you, do you find yourself in despair? Do you find yourself giving up hope? Or do you find yourself in a new level of dependence on God? Do you find yourself leaning into your faith or pulling away from it? You see, God may look weak, but don't underestimate him. He loves to play the underdog. Loves to play the underdog. Jesus came as a baby. He could have come as a warrior. He could have come as anything, but he came as a baby, and he always wins. And so when God looks weak, remember, my God is my rock. He's stronger than he looks, and he's stronger than anything you've put your hope in yet. David declared, he sang, my God is my rock, my God is my rock. But even after David was reminded by his men of God's refuge, David didn't always look to God for help. This is the story of David, right? David is an amazing man, a man after God's own heart. He was God's anointed king. He was the standard by which every king in Israel would be judged after him. And yet, and he can say in in chapter 23, verse 5, he says, if my house were not right with God, surely he would not have made me an everlasting covenant, arranged or secured in every part, surely he would not have bring to fruition my salvation and grant me my every desire. David can say all that, and yet then the list of David's mighty men, if you read all of chapter 23, and you've got to read all of chapter 23 because it's in the very last verse, in the list of David's mighty men, the last mighty man named was Uriah the Hittite, who was the husband of Bathsheba, whom David killed to cover up that he had slept with his wife. It's like this huge red flag at the end of the book, reminding us that David's house was not always right with God, despite what David said. And this is kind of the point. This is kind of the point of David's life. This is kind of the point of the whole series. David was a great king, the best Israel ever had, and yet not good enough. David was a man after God's own heart, and yet not always. And so a greater king had to come. A descendant of David, but who was better than David. One who did not fail when tempted. One who was truly a man after God's own heart because he was God's own son. Fully a man after God's own heart. And when he came, he told anyone who would listen to build their life on him, on the rock. And then he delivered living water, not at the risk of his life, like David's men, but at the cost of his life. He delivered living water to you and me. As you sit in your cave, he shows up and puts the canteen on your table. So that anyone who puts their trust in him can say with David, my house is right with God. God has made an everlasting covenant with me, and he has brought to fruition my salvation. He will give me my every desire. If you've put your faith in Jesus, or even if you decide right now to put your faith in Jesus, that is true of you. And so say it, declare it, believe it, hold to it with all your heart, and most of all, sing it. My God is my